Welcome, my name is Emma Widdis. I'm the Professor of Slavonic Studies in the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages and Linguistics. And it's our pleasure that this event is opening our year-long series of lectures under the heading of Freedom, which is co-sponsored by CAMKEYS, the Cambridge Centre, which deals with our region broadly understood. And we're co-hosting this event this evening with our colleagues in the Centre for Geopolitics, the director of which, Professor Brendan Sims, will be leading discussion afterwards. We in Slavonic Studies share with the Centre a commitment to historical and cultural study as founding blocks for any analysis of the present. And Brendan's work on European geopolitics, past and present, make him an ideal interlocutor for this evening. So I'm delighted to see as many of you here this evening, and it's testament to our particular speaker and to her topic, of course, but I believe also to the pressing imperative for those of us engaged in the study of Russia, broadly understood, but not only for us, of course, of discussing the themes of freedom, authoritarianism, and democracy, around which our series is organized with historical and geographical reach. So do look at the other events in our series. This evening, we really are truly honored to open the series with a lecture from and discussion with Ekaterina Schulmann. To give you a brief sense of the format before I introduce Professor Schulmann, we're going to listen to a lecture, Surrogates of Freedom, Authoritarian Rituals of Power and Citizens' Notions of Liberty. And then we're going to have a discussion led by Professor Sims, and then questions and answers from all of you, a discussion with the group. So, Ekaterina Schulmann is a political scientist who specializes in the legislative processes, bureaucracy and decision-making mechanisms in contemporary autocracies. So could there be anything more pressing in this moment, with a particular focus on Russia? Before 2022, she was an associate professor at the Moscow School of Social and Economic Sciences and a senior lecturer at RANEPA at the Presidential Academy of National Economy and Public Administration. She moved to Berlin in 2022 for reasons that I'm sure are clear to all of you, where she's currently teaching political science, so those students are the beneficiaries of that moment, at the Osteuropa Institute in the Freie Universität, and she's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center. She is the author of several important works of political science, most recently co-author of the 2018 publication, The New Autocracy, Information, Politics and Policy in Putin's Russia, but really also a political scientist who uses examples for Russia, but whose interventions are into political science more broadly. She's well known, therefore, as a political scientist, but also as one of the most insightful analysts of contemporary Russia at a historical moment when such insight and such analysis is urgently needed. She stands out as a scholar, but also as a scholar who has been able to bring her wisdom to bear in communicating with audiences at all levels, including with her weekly broadcasts, previously on Echo Moskvy, now on YouTube, where her channel has more than 1.5 million subscribers. Now, we were discussing earlier the complexity of the category of the public intellectual in the Anglophone Academy, at least. The French are really good at it, we decided, but in Britain it's a category that people wear uncomfortably. I would say, however, that were there such a thing as a public intellectual in the world that we live in, and such a category is much needed, I think, then we would hope very much that it would be one like Ekaterina who knows how to inhabit that role properly. So with those words, I invite you to join with me in welcoming her to speak to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this detailed and flattering introduction. Of course, it's almost unbearable to hear oneself described as a public intellectual, the pomposity and the self-importance of it. But really, I think what is meant here is that I speak in public a lot and people tend to listen, at least from time to time. As has been mentioned here, I study autocracies and such fascinating things as bureaucratic behavior. Of course, what can be more compelling as a field of study? Therefore, when I was invited to speak at this conference, I had to twist my subject in a certain way to fit the category of freedom, because this is a notion, the idea that very seldom occurs in the course of my specific study. So I decided that I would tackle two questions. The one is exactly about regime behavior. And this is the question of why political systems that are manifestly undemocratic, I would say proudly and unashamedly undemocratic, still uphold or imitate democratic institutions and procedures. First and foremost, the electoral procedures and processes. We get this question, we people who study this or that autocracy, be it Russia, be it Turkey or Kazakhstan, we get this question, why wouldn't they stop the thing altogether and do the plain and honest appointment rather than go through the expense, the trouble, and yes, the inherent risk of an electoral process? There is an answer. In fact, like in all social sciences, there's a plethora of answers with which I hope to acquaint you. So I would like to talk about these rituals and imitations of freedom that autocracies indulge in, I would say revel in, and the reasons they do it. The second question is, what do people living in a non-free environment understand when they talk and think about freedom? What rights and freedoms seem important to them? What do they think when they participate in these rituals that ought to have been meaningful but are no longer so? What do they mean when they say the word freedom? For this part, we'll have to rely heavily on polling information, on sociological data, and of course, it is difficult to get people to express their opinions in the environment where opinions are prohibited from being expressed. But I will maybe say a few words a bit later about the difficulties and the way they circumvent them. My point is, we need not despair and give up on polling altogether, because there is such a notion that if there is no freedom, if there's censorship, if sociological services themselves are heavily controlled by the government, then we need pay no attention to sociological data. This is manifestly wrong, but a bit more of this hereafter. So, the question of why do autocracies engage in spectacles of choice, spectacles of debate, in short, imitations of freedom, when they cannot afford the real thing, has been asked to political scientists, and it has been asked by political science to itself. For now, there are three main ways to answer these questions. Why elections in autocracies? Why other democratic institutions in autocracies and authoritarian regimes? The first type of answer is the so-called window dressing theory. It says, generally, that political systems need to project an appearance of normality in order to impress both their own citizenry and external audiences with the idea that they are normal. So these imitations are in fact window dressing, to put it primitively, in order to look good. This applies both to those countries that, being smaller and poorer, depend on their neighbors or on international community for help. So they need to pretend, for example, numerous military regimes of Southern Africa or Latin America. Very often, well, almost always, they have to produce some sort of electoral event in order to be in their turn applicable for example, international funding, help from international organizations, etc. But those countries that can afford to have a bad international image still need this kind of window dressing. Let us pay more attention to the projection of normality point. At this moment in history, having regular elections, having at least a pretense of a multi-party parliament, having at least a semblance of a more or less diverse public sphere has become the norm. This seems to be self-evident, but really it's worthy of a moment of thought. Why is this normal rather than the other way around. Democracies are sometimes seen as historical exceptions. And really, when we come to think of the simplicity, the resilience, the, I would say, sinister naturalness of authoritarian models, we perhaps will no longer be surprised that democracies can be subverted, but we'll be surprised that democracies survive. But they do survive. And democratization is still a process, although authoritarian renaissance is also a thing. But what is important here is that normality today means at least imitating these riddles of freedom, including elections. The second answer to this question is the so-called co-optation theory. It says that autocracies, especially those which are less solidified, the so-called competitive autocracies or informational autocracies, spin dictatorships as they are called sometimes, they use these instruments of publicity, instruments of elections, in order to integrate potential challengers, in order to make those who could challenge the system part of the system. This explanation also shows us some part of political reality. But I must say that these games of co-optation, read them, they happen in autocracies till a certain moment of their evolution. When they have solidified their repressive apparatus, they no longer care to co-opt. What they do is rather to exclude than to include, which in turn tends to radicalize those excluded, while co-optation is generally the instrument to preserve stability of any political system, because people who get inside the system have to play by the rules, more or less. So generally, co-optation belongs not just to autocracies, democracies do that too. The third explanation is the theory of administrative stock exchange or administrative marketplace. It says that even in a solidified autocracy, where power is concentrated in the hands of the very few, in personalist autocracies, it's concentrated in the hands of the leader, in the absence of durable institutions. But even there, you cannot rule the country by yourself or with the help of your 5 friends. So you need, well, you don't need, you just have. You have interest groups. You have various groups among the elites. And these groups need to coordinate with each other, to compete with each other in a way that does not shatter the stability of your system. They need to trade favors, they need to come to agreements. And while in an autocracy there's a number of issues that belong solely to political leadership and are untouchable by anybody else, still there's a number of other questions. Say there's, if we talk about legislation, which is my particular field of study, so I talk about it a lot, if you have, for example, non-political legislation, or one that is seen as non-political, for example, dealing with economic issues, banking, investment, finance, etc., you need certain expertise and you need some platform for these interests to be coordinated and for this expertise to be presented. And parliaments and even media is this natural kind of platform to use for those purposes that even an autocracy needs. So the answer is that elections are used to, for example, distribute mandates between regional power groups in a way to keep them happy. Parliaments are also platforms, if not for political discussion, as the famous phrase is, parliament is no place for political discussion, has been said by one of the previous speakers of the Russian State Duma, but still certain types of discussions do take place there. And the press, while it is prohibited from addressing an elephant in the room, in every authoritarian room there's a number of elephants that cannot be mentioned. But there's smaller mice that can perhaps be discussed for the general good of, well, if not of the community, then at least of the system itself. So, to generalize, there's perhaps one more thing that we ought to mention here. all those three explanations are valid. I think none of them covers the whole of the reality, but they show us different facets thereof. But one thing that we should perhaps notice, both projecting the image and the impression of normality, co-opting political actors, giving interest groups an opportunity to trade and influence decision-making and coordinate with each other, does not belong solely to an autocracy. Democracies do all that too. This is not to say that the two are no different. They are very much different, believe me. But generally, the number of social interactions is limited. It's very hard to find in any given political system certain ways of doing things that belong to it only. The difference lies in the degree and in the validity of the instruments that are being used. So, if we speak specifically of elections, then in an autocracy, elections also provide a sort of feedback that they provide for a democracy. But in a democracy, this feedback is not contained to just learning people's opinion through this huge sort of poll. Elections in democracies, of course, can change the composition of power and so impact policies. Whoever wins the elections becomes then the holder of the mandate. Autocracies cannot afford this thing, but in their mimic electoral events, as we prefer to call them, also in their imitational mass rallies, where people are brought to in buses, and students have to go if they want to get a good mark, and all these things that are well known to inhabitants of any given autocracy. Or, I think those of you who have studied political science know what this acronym means, GONGA. It means government-organized non-governmental organizations. If you can pronounce it really quickly, you get a degree in political science. So practice. These are imitative civil society organizations. So autocracies do this in order to receive dual feedback. First, from the people. People participate in these spectacles of loyalty in order to, sometimes in their own opinion, to behave like good citizens. And so the leadership knows that the population is loyal. Almost every autocracy, when conducting elections, tends to aim at lower voters' turnout. They will always talk about wanting everyone to participate, but in reality, they want lower turnout because higher turnout makes election results less predictable. It increases the risk. But they want the so-called administratively dependent electorate to turn out and vote, and all the rest need to stay at home. The instruments used to achieve this double aim are really quite sophisticated. For example, those who are oppositionally minded and whom the government doesn't want on polling stations have to be brought to a state of such disgust with the electoral procedure itself so that they wouldn't want to have anything to do with it. While the administratively dependent, the budgetary workers, state workers, people who work in law enforcement, etc., they need to turn out. And in this way, the system sees that its people, those people it depends on, are still loyal to it. Good citizenry behavior stemming since Soviet times in case of Russia means that you have to be at the polling station as early as possible. It's really fascinating to see where this custom originated. The ritual of Soviet elections was invented in 1936 with the adoption of the so-called Stalin's constitution. Stalin's constitution that replaced the previous early Soviet documents gave voting rights to all the citizens. It was a highly progressive step at the time because previously there was a large category of those called lishenцы, the former people who were bereft of both active and passive voting right. And the voting was open. There was no secret ballot, because we're all comrades here. What do we have to hide? But the Constitution of 1936 was less revolutionary. As a document, it much more resembled European constitutions of that time, producing all the window dressing that was thought necessary, including political rights and freedoms, social guarantees, etc. It did not even say specifically that on the ballot there has to be only one party and only one candidate. It gave the right to have candidates to various organizations, including trade unions, youth organizations, and the like. They just didn't choose to do it because their interests were so brilliantly represented by Communist Party delegates. So, with this innovation, arrived the ritual that, sadly, has kept itself more or less intact, not just through the rule of Stalin, but even survived the collapse of the Soviet system. So, a balloting station has to be festively decorated. You need to sell food. There has to be music. People need to turn out as early as possible. In Stalin's times, they opened at 6 o'clock. And 6 a.m., of course. And we know from reports from the local authorities to Moscow, they said people foregather since 4 a.m. at the doors of the polling station, dancing and singing, because elections is a festival. You have to go with your whole family. Even now, electoral observers on the stations, such as Remain, have difficulties explaining to the families that you don't all go into the booth. Because usually it's the mother of the family that decides the way we vote, and they don't understand why do we need to go one by one. We have no secrets from each other. So this whole ritual, I must say, is an institution. Institutions can be organizations, institutions can be ways of behavior, practices. And what makes institutions institutional is that people change and they remain. So this particular institution survived through decades. So the second kind of feedback that autocracies get from their electoral events is feedback from the apparatus. These are nationwide events. Hundreds of thousands of people, in case of Russia, participate in them. On a very local level, they sit on electoral commissions. These are people who work in regional and local governments, the so-called political management, the media, people who had industries. They need to make sure that their workers turn out in proper numbers at the proper hour and vote. So this is the exercise for the generalized bureaucracy. So the top management can see that this bureaucracy is both loyal and effective, that they will and they can organize large-scale events of this kind. They have to be organized with a certain degree of outward decency, at least how outward decency is understood within the system. For example, loud scandals connected with falsifications are not seen as proper. All sorts of, any sort of protest is, of course, frowned upon. Everything has to go smoothly in this light and pleasant, festive manner. Again, it's a kind of celebration. What do people actually celebrate? As I said, the administratively dependent electorate feels that they are going through a good citizen's test. They are doing the good and proper thing. They understand that elections don't change anything. They know the results as well as anybody else. But they think that since they owe something to the state that feeds them, the state that employs them, the state that, as they imagine, protects them, then in return, they need to jump through certain hoops once a year. The general election day, which in Russia is usually in early autumn when people's optimism levels are the highest. So, just a couple of words about the difference between Soviet elections and modern authoritarian elections. Although, as I said, the Stalinist constitution did not specifically prohibit alternative elections, of course, they were non-alternative. You had only one name, only one candidate, only one party on your ballot. Modern autocracies can't afford this. They have to have at least two. And the problem is that electoral mechanism as such has been constructed by people older and wiser than all the modern autocrats put together for the use of the freedom of choice. And unless you go the Soviet way and have just one item on your menu, you always run the risk of the so-called turnover election. We have known of cases in various smaller scale African regimes where the imitative candidate suddenly won because people are so disgusted with the incumbent that they will vote for anybody. The main instrument that autocracies use to ensure the necessary electoral result is not really falsification. It's the barrier for getting involved. So you can't become a candidate unless you are vetoed by the system itself. Our Latin American colleagues call those false competitors, those spoiler candidates, electoral rabbits. But, as I said, there's always the risk. Today he's a rabbit, but tomorrow, suddenly feeling the support of the people, they can evolve into a different kind of animal altogether. Generally, the comparison that came to my head when I was studying all this was the following. If you remember Lord of the Rings, the main plot line concerns a group of noble creatures, free people, representatives of the free people, who are carrying an artifact that is inherently evil. It serves evil. It attracts the attention of evil creatures. It makes them visible to the Lord that created it, who is evil. It meddles with their minds. It makes them quarrel among themselves. It awakens the worst in their natures. Now imagine the opposite situation. Imagine a group of orcs that carries an elfish creation that was made for the purposes of good. It makes them uncomfortable. It burns their hairy little paws. It awakens whatever elfish is still in their nature. Their fur starts to fall out and they evolve into something completely different. It makes them visible to the powers of good and so doubly uncomfortable. This is the election process, or rather the institution of competitive elections. Autocracies hate it. They want to break it, but they can never completely subvert it, which is the beauty of the thing. Although at the moment it seems like they can. So much for the system. Now to the people. I will be using sociological data from today's Russia. Again, with all due disrespect to the state of public opinion surveys in the country, still, as I said, we cannot afford to just ignore all this information. We know that when you ask people direct questions like, do you love the president as he deserves to be loved, or do you want to get 15 years of penal colony, the results are striking but not very informative. However, if you ask questions that have no immediate political relevance and that are not directly mentioned in the criminal code, and especially when you compare the so-called long rows of the data, and the only valuable thing in sociological data, of course, can be seen in comparison. No figure means anything on its own. Again, we get these questions all the time. We have this latest poll and we have this figure. What does it mean? Again, by itself, it means nothing. It can only be understood in comparison. So, this is Levada. What rights and freedoms are more important? This is pretty recent. The last results are pretty recent. They are from July 2024. So already pretty far into the latest war. You will see the dynamic. So from 2017 to 2024, the first and foremost right is the right to live, be free, and for personal safety, personal integrity, I would say. This is the most popular right, although we see an interesting decline in figures between 2021 and 2024. One would wonder what happened to make the right to live less popular. Perhaps the respondents have given up hope to have this right at all. So the second two are the social rights. Rather, the second is the social right, the right for medical assistance, the right to health care. The third is the judiciary, fair trial. And here we generally have in 2024 decrease in all kinds of answers. So this gives us kind of an idea of what people are thinking about. The fourth, freedom of speech. The fifth, labor rights and fair and equal payment. The sixth is social security generally. The seventh is indemnity of property, safety of property, and habitation. Next come education, equal access to education. I don't think you'll see anything exotic in this listing, although I must say that the second place for the right to healthcare, this one, tells of an aging society in which healthcare is seen as more important than education. Here's education. But all these first seven, let's put it this way, are seen as important. You will, of course, understand by the numbers that it was possible to choose as many rights and freedoms as you want. So this is a bit more complicated, and sorry for the Russian of it. I will try to explain what is it and why is it important. It's the choice between material good, material welfare, financial welfare, and freedom. So the question that was asked was this: whether material well-being is the most important and freedom is secondary, or second option, freedom, the lack of freedom makes human life meaningless. So the dark part is this first answer, that freedom is paramount. The second, the lighter, is the most important is financial well-being, and freedom will follow, so it's secondary. This is the survey of 2022, and these groups, these again complicated groups, they are different political stratas: loyalist conservatives, loyalist Westerners. It was possible to be a loyalist Westerners back then. Non-loyal conservatives, non-loyal Westerners, Western Democrats, mixed opinions, opponents to the Western model of democracy. Look at this, for example. These are people who don't like Western democracy, and still 61, as opposed to 37 among them, think that freedom is the most important thing. So including those who think that, so this is interesting, the majority of threats for Russia come from abroad. Majority of threats for Russia come from within. Those who think that the threats and challenges come from within are more supportive of the priority of freedom, but those who think that foreign threat is the most important, also 64% of them think that freedom is important. What do people understand when they talk about freedom? This cannot be seen from polling as such, from the so-called quantitative polls, but when we come to results of focus groups, we see the following. Quite often, freedom is understood as freedom from want. The freedom to buy whatever I want and consequently to do whatever I want. Poverty is seen as the manifest state of unfreedom, which is, again, rational enough. Among those freedoms that Russians call important, just a bit back, the right for free speech is, and by the way, it became one of the most popular in 2022, COVID, and less popular in 2024, because it's hopeless anyway, but still, it's seen as more important in 2024 than it was in 2017, which is interesting. So, a few more slides, and we're done. These come from one of my favorite institutions, the Institute of Sociology of the Russian Academy of Sciences. They conduct, and have been conducted for years, the so-called surveys of values. They study the values of the Russian people, both by doing big polls, traditional quantitative polls, and focus groups. These are results of 2014 to 2018. And the question is this, what values should Russia's future be built upon? The most popular one is social justice, справедливость. One of our Russian umbrella terms, a pretty mysterious word. It has many meanings. It can have different meanings depending on the situation. Sometimes it means equality, and sometimes it means making an exception. Sometimes it means mercy, sometimes it means revenge. So it's one of the cornerstones of our Russian consciousness, but I don't think that anyone can tell exactly what this справедливость is. But people name it as the most important thing, and you see the growth between 2014 and 2018. The second, by the way, and also 10 percentage point growth in 4 years, human rights, democracy, freedom of self-expression. Number 3, Russia should be a great power. No growth, substantial figures, but still. Return to national traditions, moral and religious values, rather a decrease. The strong hand, the fabled strong hand. Tough power that can uphold order. 26. And by the way, coming closer to the West, good relations with modern developed countries. But that was 2018, the high point of our previous wave of modernization, which was more or less buried under the rebel of the war. But still, and by the way, look at this. Russia for Russians, 10 and here 12. 2 percentage points in 4 years, which is, I think, should be attended to. This I have translated, so I hope it makes it easier for you, because this is the most recent thing that they have. As I said, they've been doing it for years, since 1995, hence this formula that now looks, to put it mildly, suspicious. What concepts and values should the revival of Russia be based on, as if the revival is not already happening? But this is the formula they've been using, and thanks for this, they have kept it. So, point number 1, justice, but rather in decline. Point number 2, peace. See the growth? 2022, 2023, now we are reaching the 1995 level when, as you know, the Chechen war was raging and there was a rather active terrorist campaign going on inside the country. This is order. Again, the famous strong hand, declining in popularity, suspiciously declining in popularity since the middle of the 10th years. Human rights, less popular than in 1995, but still important. Law, законность, rule of law. So here's our freedom, almost on the same level as 1995. higher than, for example, in the year 2000, when was its minimum. This is equality, равенство. And by the way, one of the things that are perceptible from the polls is the sudden rise in, by sudden I mean steep, rise in popularity of socialism as opposed to capitalism as a system under which the respondents would prefer to live. That was exactly the question. Would you prefer to live under socialism or capitalism? So suddenly socialism is all the rage these days. I suspect this is due to a combination of the notoriously leftist mode of the younger generation and the aging generation desire for a welfare state. So this is equality. This is statehood. Державность. I didn't know how to properly translate it. Державность is the greatness of state power, the authority of state power. This is it. Not very popular, but still perceptible. This is patriotism. That the president says is Russian official ideology and the only ideology that is possible. But you see how low it lies? So these are the popular answers. I think no less expressive are the less popular answer. This is culture. It hadn't been mentioned before 2014. Now it's quite in the polls. Constructive development, созидание. Созидание is constructive work. Work for the good of the community. So here's socialism. You see, it was more popular as a concept in 1995, but it is evidently growing. I think that socialism and equality is appealing to approximately the same category. Great power status, not that much. Согласие, concord. I think this can be included in the peace category. Spirituality, духовность, the famous Russian духовность. See the decline? What has happened to the country of general spirituality? Morality is нравственность, whatever that means. Народовластие, popular rule, not that much. This is not very perceptible, but this is USSR. The return to, no, I'm afraid that's my fault. I couldn't make this table to fit into the slide. You know when you can see it on your laptop, but once it's on the screen, it disappears. So this is USSR, the return to the Soviet system. You see, this is 10% in 1997, and this is 6%. So this is this is the same thing, but among young people. And if we return for a moment to this, I have not included anything that is below 5%, but I must say that traditional values, Orthodox religion, and Russia for the Russians, here was all below 5%. So you see, the thing is, the manifestly declared values of the authorities, of the leadership, are in sharp contrast with what the people want. Perhaps the one thing they have in common is order, порядок. But human rights is never mentioned. Justice, справедливость, not that much. Peace, you can go to prison for this. Law, also not popular. But again, traditional values, return to the roots, the power of Orthodox Church, all this is pronounced from the highest platforms in the country. But it does not seem to go well with the people. So this is specifically for young people, and it's 2022 already in the second half of the year, when the war has already started. So here are the young people. This is really inconvenient because it doesn't come in the order of popularity. But here's number one, freedom. This is very important, somewhat important, not really important, not important, negative. So freedom is very important for almost 60% of the respondents. And this is law, you see, lawfulness, законность, 63%. This is peace, number one, 70.7 in 2022. Again, as we say in Russian internet, ой, а что случилось? So what has happened? So this is patriotism, much less popular. Here's our fairness. This is justice, fairness. Also 70%. Collectivism, not so much, but individual initiative is 30%. Collectivism is 25%. Generally speaking, and if we look at, for example, World Values Survey, when it was still carried out in Russia, fortunately the last wave, the, I think, 7th wave, that ended in 2022 still could be done on the Russian territory, we see that the values expressed by Russian respondents very much resemble those in other Central European and Eastern European countries. However, in the specific and I would say rather unsavory combination of individualism, consumerism, a lack of collectivism, including such types of traditionality as belonging to a religious community, Russian society rather resembles the Chinese. This, I think, is the heritage of a totalitarian regime. They leave their societies atomized, cynical, rather anomic, and concentrated on individual success and consumerism. Again, nothing could be in sharper contrast to what the authorities are saying. I promised you the least popular answers. Orthodoxy, православие, народность, national identity. Private property is not popular either. People don't think that this is the value on which Russian future should be based. But if we ask about what freedoms are important, private property will be among the top list. But among popular freedoms, especially after 2017, freedom of speech has risen sharply, but this has declined with the start of the war. So, what can we say in conclusion before we proceed to my favorite part, the Q&A part? When citizens in a relatively poor society talk about freedom, they very often mean freedom from material want, freedom from the constraints of poverty. But they also mean freedom of movement, which is connected with the previous item. Inevitably, you need money in order to move around, in order to travel. They mean freedom of information, as I would read it, rather than freedom of speech. Not so much the right for self-expression, although that too, as the right to get information. The way Russian population has been consuming information and the way it has been changing its informational consumption habits is very expressive. The decline of TV watching has been happening since 2016. And during the war, and especially after such events as mass mobilization, the masses of viewers went from TV to Telegram because they have understood that they can no longer rely on official sources to provide relevant information. And by the way, one last point on that subject. People often ask, why do Russians still watch TV if they also demonstrate low levels of trust for TV as a source of information? The answer is, these TV channels are perceived, and correctly perceived, as the voice of the authority. And you need to know what do these people have in mind. So you listen in order to be aware. And post-Soviet people are very adept, are very expert, I would say, in reading the language. They know that when they are told, don't worry about the safety of your bank deposits, it's time to go to the bank, double quick. So, but you can't afford to completely miss this information. When people choose order as their valued value, they often mean order not as opposed to freedom, but as opposed to lawlessness and arbitrariness. In the same vein, the popularity of the so-called strong hand, which, by the way, has been declining for the last 8 to 5 years, is also seen as an antidote against the безнаказанность, Again, one of our Russian words that are difficult to translate. How would you translate безнаказанность? Impunity. Yes, impunity. But English impunity refers to, again, in my mind, to an accident. He could kill her with impunity because circumstances allowed this. But безнаказанность, the Russian безнаказанность, is the state of things, where those in power can do whatever and there's no checks and balances. So the strong hand is seen, or rather was seen, as an antidote to this. And I think its declining popularity is also connected with the fact that people perceive more and more that the strong hand in question actually protects those in power rather than the people. And by the way, if I could bother you with some more polling results, you will see that across the years and after 2022, there's a vast predominance of those who say people in authority only care about themselves, as opposed to those who say the government works in the interest of the people. So the Russian respondents have a pretty realistic understanding of the system they are dealing with. What perhaps they miss is the degree to which their own endless adaptability is the supporting pillar of the system that they seem to understand so well. So, thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them.
So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to discuss this a little bit with Ekaterina for, I think, 10 to 15 minutes, and then we will move to general audience discussion. I'd like to begin by saying that I found that absolutely terrific, the way in which you showed us what freedom means in Russia, what it doesn't mean, and then widening out into a general overview, but with statistics on what Russians actually think, or what they would like us to think they think. And can you all hear me? Yeah. So what surprised me, and may have surprised others, is that you seem to be describing actually a serious disjuncture between the population and the elites on the overall project in, shall we say, in Ukraine. In other words, the idea that the population will accept sacrifices for great powerness, for standing. That's a proposition which we hear a lot in the West and a lot in the analytical community. And yet, when one looks at the figures you've provided at one level, it seems actually, patriotism, great powerness, and there were a number of other descriptors there, don't seem to be so highly regarded. In fact, in some ways, they seem to have gone down. Is that a correct understanding of what you've been saying?
That's a very astute observation. And if you look not just at the figures, but at the behavior of Russian political system, you will see that the authorities are perfectly aware of the fact. With all their babbling about patriotism and how happy Russians are to die for the sake of the motherland, the actual way they wage this war is purely commercial. Participation is voluntary, with all due respect to marginal cases where people have been kidnapped, etc. Mostly, the vast majority go voluntarily. They sign a contract, they receive payments. The payments have been ever increasing till the very last moment, which is a very curious development, but outside of our today's subject, though a fascinating one. So, this is on one hand. On the other hand, all the efforts of the governmental machine have been to preserve the appearance of normalcy for the beyond the frontline territory. Russians have had to believe that this war is happening mostly on TV, and we're winning. It's going brilliantly. And it actually carries advantages. You can make money by signing a contract. You can make money by working for the military-industrial complex. There's a general increase, and there is an increase. Well, there has been an increase till quite recently in people's general incomes. Money has come into those territories and those sectors where they have been absent during previous decades. So the general idea was that war is a very good thing indeed. It benefits everyone, even if you don't get an increase of salary and is subjected to high inflation, still you can enjoy the show on TV, you can root for your own team, you can get cheap, free, actually, emotions. You can feel you belong to something that is greater than yourself, which is one of our basic human needs. So not only have the authorities been calling on people to sacrifice whatever, they've been extremely anxious to make them the beneficiaries of this war. I think with the full understanding that the moment real sacrifices arrive, people will be much less ready to adapt to circumstances, to agree that this is a given. Now is the moment, a very interesting moment indeed, when there's less benefits to hand around and the negative results of the war are starting only now. Again, it may seem surprising, but we're a large country. Only now it's beginning to seep through, and we see it even in whatever twisted and faulty results that we are getting.
Thank you. So what you've just said is absolutely plausible. But what again is surprising, if you take, say, the Ukrainian incursion, or quite a long incursion, into Kursk, what surprised me is you could imagine a Russian society that thinks all the things that you've just outlined, but would then draw the line at the sovereign territory of, Mother Russia being violated. And yet the regime had to depend on imports, essentially, of North Korean soldiers to remove the Ukrainians. How does that, I mean, this is obviously not contradicting what you've said, but can you add a little bit more context around that? I mean, did that presence of the Ukrainians affect Russian opinion at all? How did it leave its mark?
Yes, we didn't look good there, did we? And you know what? We know, both from hearsay and from actual decisions taken after, during, and after these Kursk excursions, that Russian leadership was extremely disappointed and angered at the unpredictable behavior of Kursk people. Because in their, bless their old heads, they have this idea of Soviet pictures about the Great Patriotic War, where people are defending their homes till their last breath. What did the people of Kursk do? They demanded evacuation. They were absolutely in a hurry to leave the place. They had to have buses from the regional administration sent to them to take them away, which was manifestly rational. And then they demanded compensations, which was as non-heroic as you can possibly imagine. There was quite a wave of compassion for the refugees, although the compassion was the strongest the further the people were removed from the actual scene of action. So it was strongest in Moscow, where people were collecting warm things and money, etc., to help the refugees. But the closer you get to actual Kursk, and if you get to the Kursk region itself, not directly affected by the incursion, but near it, there people were unhappy. We don't know where to put them. These refugees are, I don't know, they're suspicious people. Maybe they will steal something. And if we can't get rid of them altogether, then we will sell things for them for double price. That was also not that patriotic. So the authorities were unhappy about it, and I think unpleasantly surprised by this. As a result, first, almost all the former authorities of Kursk region are now under arrest. One has shot himself. The new governor that has been sent to Kursk is, I don't know how to explain it. Yes, but how can I explain to you the symbolic meaning of this gesture? Can I say he's one of the worst? There's not much to choose from, but if you have such a person sent to, I know him from the times when he was on the State Duma deputy. Again, all Russians understand, but it's hard to explain without being homophobic and all the rest of it put together. Again, that's the best feature in him. All the rest are much worse. But it is a gesture of contempt. It cannot be explained in any other way. Even not going into the gory details, he's a journalist. He's been what we call in our expressive Russian a snitch. That's what his journalistic career has been all about. He has no connection with the territory at all. He has no managerial experience whatsoever. So that was the expression of the attitude in Moscow towards these people of Kursk. There are other minor gestures, for example, the Federal Center's policy towards these compensations. Various declarations like, in these difficult times for the motherland, all you know is you demand money. So yes, there is a contrast between what the leadership, well, there's a contrast between what the leadership thinks its people are like. But that is on the highest level because it's the most isolated and the most prone to senile fantasies. But on a lower level of practical government, people who are constructing the system, for example, conscription system, the system of getting enough kontraktniki for the ministry, the system of setting up military-industrial production, they know what they're doing. And they're very far from imagining a society that is bent on sacrificing anything at all.
Do I still have time for a couple more? Yeah. From your description, the aspiration towards freedom and what might broadly be called Western values is still very strong in the society. And yet, as you say, what has gone wrong from our point of view in Russia can be traced back in one way or another to the experience of totalitarianism, or at least a lot of it, under the Soviet Union. And so it reminds me a bit of Viktor Chernomyrdin's famous comment, which I'm sure you know about. You know, we hoped for the best, but it turned out as usual.
We wanted the best.
We wanted the best, but it turned out as usual. Or some such, anyway. The general drift was, you know, that's the way things happen. So I know this is an enormous question, but I think it will be in people's minds. At what point do you think it went wrong after the fall of communism, or do you think it was always going to go wrong in the Chernomyrdin sense, because this is Russia?
When first started the bloody conflict, depends on your definition of wrong. I, as a political scientist, as a social scientist, I don't believe in equifinality, which is exactly the meaning of Chernomyrdin's bon mot. I don't think that results are predicted. I don't think that there's such a thing as what we call in Russian kolya, the way that you can't escape. Societies are nothing if not changeable. Human creatures are nothing if not adaptable. They are not doomed to anything, either good or bad. No society is doomed to authoritarianism forever, nor can any democracy be established forever. No one is immune to an authoritarian decline. Democracy is like brushing your teeth. You can't do it once and forever. You have to repeat it twice every day as long as you live. It's the same with democracy. And again, I mentioned the word naturalness in connection with an authoritarian rule. It's so primitive that it seems almost to reassemble itself the moment you look away. Democracy needs maintenance, but autocracies, they grow like fungus. Again, it's like with the teeth. If you don't do anything, you get this. In order to get something different, you have to do things. I'm also an institutionalist, so when asked where did things go wrong, or at least what should have been done differently, my answer is this. What has not been done in the 90s is the dismantling of state repressive institutions that ought to have been destroyed or at least divided into parts in order to prevent the reappearance of one of our few durable institutions, political police, which is directly connected with the former Gulag system, the penitentiary system, which is the instrument of state repression and state terror. Our reformers of the 90s were primitive Marxists. They believe in the basis and what's the proper term for nadstroika? Yes. They were building a market economy. Many thanks to them for this. And the idea was, hence come the primitive Marxism, that the superstructure will somehow construct itself. Also, simultaneously, they could not afford to dispense with an instrument of state control, which was then not the army. The army was anti-reformist, was very much into Soviet nostalgia, was voting for the communists. So they had to be supported by some armed force. And their armed force of choice was the former KGB. So they had to keep it. They did divide it from some of its parts. Now we see them reassembling like a dragon in a tail. You cut its head and then it grows out again. The question how to actually kill it is an interesting one to an institutionalist, because we are usually busy with understanding how to build institutions, how to make institutions durable, how to create institutions that are connected with the society and grow out of it. But I think the Russian question is how to destroy this particular institution. So not enough attention was paid to these instruments of state control, because reformers were thinking that they work for their advantage. They help their reformist cause. They're, bringing enlightenment to a benighted people who will not support them on the free elections because they don't know what's good for them. Reformist mentality can be surprisingly colonialist at times. This bringing the light to the uneducated idea. I was there myself when I was younger. In my defense, I can say I was very young indeed. At the start of my modest civil service career, but I remember that. It's a romantic idea. You see the image of this reformer who is sacrificing himself for the good of the people who don't even understand the value of that sacrifice. It's individualistic, romantic, and noble, but it can very quickly convert into demophobia, into the idea that if you give electoral rights to these people, they will elect a Hitler, of course. And this is, if not the only thing, but one of the horses of the apocalypses that have brought us to where we are right now.
I've got one more question, and then I'll turn it over to audience questions. What you say about the fact that no society is condemned to eternal autocracy is obviously very attractive, and I'm sure it's true, and is also, I think, is borne out by even the Russian experience, not in the sense of it ever fully liberalizing, but you can see in the past moments where governments had to change, as you know, for example, after the Crimean War, Lost War, leads to emancipation of the serfs. You can think of the establishment of the Duma, or really as a result of defeat by the Japanese, and you can think of other examples. So my question would be, how would you see a pathway to liberalization in Russia today? Would it be following perhaps defeat in war? So that would be the model I've just mentioned, say in Ukraine. And by defeat, I simply mean stalemate, at least non-victory. Or could you see it as coming out of a failed electoral experiment? I mean, you spoke very eloquently about the way in which even performative exercises can get out of control. And we have Stanley Bill here, you know about Poland in 1989, is a good example, I think, of of an election that just got out of control and actually did produce liberalization. Could you envisage that happening in Russia? Interested to hear your responses on that.
Defeat and victory, like beauty, are in the eye of the beholder these days. We are spoiled by the examples of the 20th century with their decisive defeats. No shades, no nuances there. But the majority of the wars don't end this way. So while our autocracy is strong enough, it can sell almost anything as a victory, while it has the control over TV. But, you know, in political history, it's not some one factor, the black swan, I hate this concept, it's misleading, that happen. It's usually, according to the Russian proverb, «беда не приходит одна», evils don't come alone. So I'm sure there's an analog in every... Yes, yes. Пришла беда, отворяй ворота. When misfortune comes, open your doors wide. So you get into a war that you cannot win. You spend money, you exhaust your people's patience. Then you end the war somehow. People are euphoric because they wanted this whole thing to end, and they are tired. Everyone is happy, but then economic consequences start to seep in, and people, having gone through the euphoric phase, began in the leisure hours of the post-war period to ask questions. At the very same time, you are aging and you have not provided any understandable succession mechanisms, so your elites start to fight because they can perceive the post-you era now as a reality rather than a dream. At the same time, your prime export commodity is suddenly getting cheaper. At the same time, something else accidentally happens that would not have been the factor when you were younger and stronger and richer and more popular, but now, like, your immune system is weaker, so every flu, every cold that previously would only put you in bed for 3 days will kill you during the same 3 days. This is how it happens with political bodies. So I could imagine an elite pact on the model of the post-Stalin elite pact, when his comrades of the Politburo gathered over his dead body and made an agreement that we can understand post factum. First, they have named one of their own as the worst of villains and shot him, although there was not much difference between them all. They were all over head and ears and in blood. But this one person, Lavrentiy Beria, he was amassing power. By the way, he created the superstructure. The Ministry of Internal Affairs, which combined what would later become KGB and the normal police, and the border control, and control over the Gulag system. And he even managed to join the censorship department to this ministry. And it also had the atomic project also inside it, and he was the head. So I can understand how his loving comrades saw a new Stalin, and also from Georgia, emerging before their very eyes, and could envision the next 30 years of his rule, and they didn't want that. So they killed him, and then they made a pact. What was this pact? We don't kill each other, no matter what the results of our bureaucratic disagreements, and we don't kill the families. Second, we try not to engage in a full-scale war with a sizable opponent. Even proxy wars were frowned down upon till Afghanistan. And after Stalin died, his successors very quickly drew out of the Korean War. Third, we do not engage in large-scale projects that need massive human sacrifice, like the major construction projects of the Stalinist era, the industrialization. We try to avoid mass hunger. We generally try to make people's lives livable. And this pact was kept, I would say, till the very recent moment when the elite started killing both the people and each other, and confiscate property and despoil families again. So the elites now are facing the same problem that I think they faced after Ivan the Terrible, after Peter I, after Stalin, and then now. We have had the great leader who made Russia a universal trouble, if not a great power. And we have won wars, we have lost wars, we have conducted reforms, we have built cities and destroyed cities, but this great leader has also killed us in great numbers, generally made our lives miserable, and spent the resources of the country. So how can we stay to be the elites? Because of course our privileges have to be sustained, but how not to get killed by the next one? So the post-Ivan the Terrible answer was the Boyars' Duma and Romanov's dynasty. Post-Peter I answer was after a series of coup d'etats of the 18th century, the decree of the freedom of the nobility. Peter III and Catherine II, rule in the interests of the nobility. Post-Stalin answer was the rule of nomenclatura and a milder form of Soviet regime without the Stalinist features, which never came back. No mass deportations, no hunger, no construction projects, nor the gulag as it was, nor repressions against the elites. What will the post-Putin answer be? Our best hope is that for the fourth or fifth time in our history, the elites will come to a realization that what they need is not the preservation of their privileges, but the establishment of the rule of law, rights for everyone, not exceptions for themselves. Because if they keep to the exception, the understanding, the понятие mode, in a generation or two, they will come to the same situation where neither their lives, nor freedoms, nor property is safe. Again, this is our best case scenario. There are many worst case scenarios, but I'm glad you didn't ask me about them.
Well, I won't. Maybe somebody else will.
So yes, let's turn questions to the audience.
How much time do we have so that I would measure the depth of my answers to the amount of
I'm aware that people may leave, but I'm thinking we're finishing at 7 and we'll have drinks at 7.
I will think they're living in disgust over what they have just
They
heard.
won't be. Stan, why don't we start with you, Stan?
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for that presentation and all those perspectives. I have a methodological question really about the sociological research and really to ask how you're able to interpret those concepts, because as you pointed out, the problem is because of the political environment, you're only able to ask those very abstract questions, which are notoriously unreliable in sociological research in general, and in which people are able to very easily contradict themselves. And so the specific questions and the specific ways of understanding those terms is much more important. So freedom of speech, законность or lawfulness, justice. As you said, authoritarian regimes are very good at having window dressing concepts that would be equivalent and quite happily use those terms in their discourse. And therefore, the question is really more about what those terms mean in the understanding of the people that are declaring themselves to find them important. So it's easy to say you think freedom of speech is important, but a more important question, and one that I understand is really hard to ask, would be, well, does freedom of speech end before or after LGBT plus organizations, and are they propagandists and therefore that are damaging the Russian state, and therefore freedom of speech ends there? Like freedom of speech always ends somewhere, right? And similarly with законность, what does it really mean? So it seems like those kinds of questions it's quite difficult to conclude from them alone what public opinion is. So I'm wondering what methods of analysis do you have to get, because you spoke of your optimism about those surveys at the beginning, and well, that we should have some limited optimism. So how do you interpret those concepts? How do you drill down into what people really understand by them when they use those terms? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. I would argue that in any society, the meaning of the terms of this degree of generality is combated and discussed every day. There is no final formula of what freedom of speech means. Legislation is changing in accordance to a change in societal norms. Different legal and political systems have different understanding of this. So it's not specific to Russia, or it's not specific to a society with no freedom, that people will have sometimes rather vague and changing ideas as to what it means to have freedom of speech or freedom of movement or other types of freedom. Yes, the difficulties you have named are all there. If you ask, again, in case of a non-free society, if you ask a concrete question, you will only get a socially acceptable answer. People will say the right thing. And by the way, this is also not a specific feature of authoritarian societies. Spiral of silence works everywhere. We want to be approved by our fellow creatures. Everyone wants to say the right thing. It just depends on what is the punishment for saying the wrong thing and how many environments can you possibly have in a society, how many information bubbles can you inhabit, or there's only one which is state-sanctioned, which is the authoritarian case. But people everywhere want to give the right answer and they want to look good. We need to be approved by our surrounding or we will not survive. This is our basic human instinct. So, how do we read the results? First, by combining various types of research. What I have shown here is the quantitative, the so-called representative surveys, which are good and useful. We add to them qualitative surveys, which are focus groups, in-depth interviews, etc. And so try to combine these results to understand, for example, that freedom means for a large number of respondents, freedom from poverty. That's where I got these results. Also, you can try to get around respondents by giving them different questions. For example, you mentioned freedom of speech, and where does it stop? There are surveys that ask, in a time like today, restrictions on the freedom of expressions are necessary. Yes, no, middling. This is one type of answers. Or enemies of the people, foreign agents ought not to be allowed to speak publicly. Yes, no, sometimes yes, sometimes no. And then you combine all this. And then you try to connect the dots. And maybe you are connecting all the wrong dots. Maybe you are painting an elephant where there is a camel. But yes, this is difficult. We are dealing with complicated systems, with living organisms that, yes, don't know their own mind, change their own mind all the time, and are also under pressure and fearing to say the wrong thing. And by the way, when we speak about respondents and the answers they give, we need to keep in mind that response rate in today's Russia is lower than 20%. When the war started, it went below 10%, which means that out of every 10 people you approach, as a pollster, 9 refuse to speak to you. And some people agree in the beginning, but when it comes to questions that they feel are dangerous, they drop off. So we have the loyalty bias in every review, in every poll that we read. So my personal principle is this. We cannot afford to dispense with any data. We cannot afford to base our conclusions on any one set of data. And we need to look at the long rows. So the dynamics show you the important things. For example, we say that respondents give socially acceptable, socially approved answers. But what is socially approved at the moment? This is also changing. So you will see that when we look from 1995 to 2024, we see the changes. And of course, it's always useful to look into deeper details. For example, what the young people are saying, what the poorer versus richer people in the country, people in the big cities, inhabitants of the 4 Russias, 6 Russias, and 7 Russias, etc. These are the popular concept of dividing the country into several groups. So the short answer is it's complicated.
Jack, there's a question here. And we'll try and keep questions brief and answers brief so we can get through lots.
Yes, I mean, mine is also about polls, but from a different point of view, because you gave an excellent description of the sort of participatory function of elections. And I was just wondering whether one can sort that or adapt that to polls also, although, of course, what you were just saying about very low participation at the moment kind of makes that question less relevant. But I wondered more, actually, about the purpose of polls in the eyes of of the government. I mean, what purpose they have, because, given the low participation, but also about the way that has completely changed the rhetoric of politics, because narod used to be one of the most important concepts, and although it was challenged in the Soviet period by nasilение, so the population, and massy, the masses, I mean, all the same, right to the end of Soviet power, narod, or the people, remained this concept of crucial importance. And it seems to me that in today's Russia, that's not the case. It's completely gone. People behind closed doors use the expression bydla, which is, including people in government circles, and that there's been a sort of shift at that level. And so maybe what's replaced that concept of the narod is something to do with the focus group and the sort of taking of the temperature through these sociological polls. But that's kind of a number of ideas. But anyway, it would be interesting to hear how you respond to this, the status of polls. I mean, I'm not interested in whether they're true or not. About why they're being carried out at all is really the underlying question.
It's a very interesting observation about narod. Yes, this is not a term that is used very much. The president speaks about the people, люди, наши люди. Народ is used in phrases like, ominous phrases like единый народ или один народ, which is as bad as bad can be. But to come back to a question about polling, you know what's interesting? Every political system needs feedback. The normal feedback in a functioning political system is through competitive elections, diverse media, and civic activity. If you are an autocracy, you can't afford that. So you produce imitative structures, but you still need feedback. So what do you do then? You go crazy about polling. Russian authorities are absolutely fixated on polling everything that moves. They have been using official polling organizations like ВЦИОМ. So ВЦИОМ is conducting polls by phone, by online, by old means, offline, like real people going to ask questions of real people. But there's also a department of all structures, the FSO, the federal, not the FSB, not the Federal Security Service, but basically FSO is the service of bodyguards. They have a department. This is because of one of the numerous waves of administrative reforms that happened in Russia previously. I will not trouble you with that, but for a number of reasons, they have a department that is carrying out the so-called secret polls for the government. And they even have their own budgets, so that if they discover some sort of social unrest brewing somewhere, they can quickly pour balm on troubled waters. I don't know what they do with this money. I wouldn't want to inquire. But these secret polls of FSO, they were, in my time, they were the secret polls of FAPSI, the Federal Agency of Governmental Information and Communication, which became part of FSO. I remember them, again, in my young years in Tula. I remember being shown these results saying, this is not the stuff they print in the papers, that's a real thing. And back then we still had real elections, so I could remember that this real thing was nothing like the results that actually materialized. So I hope the quality of their sociological work has increased over the decades. But my point is, I get sent these things a lot because I talk about it, and so when people get polled again on their working place, in the university, etc., they send me the questions. And it's a priceless source of information. The changes in the questions. There's the stable part, like, again, do you love the president? Do you love the government? Are you happy with things in general? But then comes the changing part. And sometimes the questions are like, what would you think if on the next parliamentary elections there would appear a party representing participants of the special military operation? How do you feel about the veterans in general? They are to be trusted, not trusted, etc. Whether the special military operation is benefiting the country or harming the country? When there was Prigozhin, there were questions about Prigozhin. After Prigozhin, there were questions about his lamented demise. So this is, again, fascinating. And I have an impression that every citizen of Russia below 18 is being questioned one day or another, because this is an ongoing work. Sometimes these questionnaires are handed out on working places. And now another thing they're doing, they are testing or studying the nation's reproductive health. So poor people in the university or in their working place get a list of questions like, when did you have sex last time? And do you have painful discharge? And whatever. So imagine the pleasure of filling this in the face of your co-workers. I get sent this too. I mean, not I as a citizen, but I as a public speaker. And people ask, what will happen if I don't answer this? And I usually write back saying refuse and say this is against the law on protection of private information. And so they will all go to prison. And if they start pressuring you, say you can see the lines, you've lost your glasses or whatever. In a day or two, they will forget all about it. Avoidance tactics, you know. But my point is that somewhere, I can even understand where, in the presidential administration, in the internal policy department of the presidential administration, there's a huge amassment of data. I don't know whether they have the power to analyze it, and whether they have the resources, well, whether they have the resources to analyze it, or whether they have the power to understand the results of this analysis. But they certainly have loads and loads of data. And they collect it all the time in order to, well, that's the irony. If you can't afford the risks of electoral rotation, you will be measuring your own imaginary rating 3 times a week, like you measure your temperature if you are nervous about your health. I don't know what they do with all these results, but I can see how they are collecting it. On the other side, towards more, the respondents, again, in a non-free environment that I have mentioned so often, have had, this may have changed, 2 ways of understanding the purposes of the polling. The pollsters are almost invariably perceived as representatives of the authorities. The idea of independent sociology is not viable. So these people come from the authorities in order to see how you behave. So you can behave in 2 ways. Either you can say, I'm happy with everything, I support whatever, get off me. Or you can use this chance to complain, because they will carry your plea to the higher up. So you can get either the unrealistically optimistic result or the unrealistically pessimistic one. I strongly suspect that those carrying out all this polling work, especially the people in the FSO, have discovered the art to manipulate these results when they present them to the authorities. So they can either say, everybody loves the leadership, people are happy, people think that the government is doing the right thing and the country is developing in the right direction. Or, at the same time, people are ready to revolt. There are very alarming tendencies on the ground. We face challenges and threats and we need more budgets. That's basic administrative business. So I strongly suspect they do that too.
I think there are many more questions, but what I suggest we do is that we finish now formally, and then everybody is invited to join us for drinks once we clear a few chairs, and then to follow up questions informally. So I'd like...
That means everyone will be drinking, but I will be answering questions.
But you get a drink first. You definitely get a drink first. So please join me in thanking Ekaterina for a hugely rich talk.